It's February 1981 in Washington County, Ohio. Lieutenant Joe Clark is a well-respected officer with the Sheriff's Department. He's known for his integrity, his passion for fighting crime, and his unwavering dedication to making his community a safer place. Joe's reputation extends far beyond just his colleagues. Residents of the county know him as the kind of officer who always follows through, whether it's a minor dispute or a major criminal case. He's the officer who shows up first, stays until the job is done, and never compromises his principles. He believes in justice, not just as a profession, but as a personal duty. Those who wear the badge alongside him trust him completely, knowing that if they ever find themselves in danger, Joe Clark will be the one standing between them and harm. At home, Joe is a family man. He and his wife, Patricia, have built a life together filled with love, laughter, and dreams for the future. Friends and colleagues describe him as a man who never backed down from his duty, no matter the danger. But beyond the badge, Joe is just as devoted to his family. He and Patricia have a bond built on trust and years of shared experiences. When he comes home from long shifts, he doesn't bring the stress with him. Instead, he unwinds with his wife, sharing quiet moments of peace. His dream is to one day retire, to take Patricia on long road trips across the country, to enjoy the life they worked so hard to build. But those dreams will never come to pass. That night, the couple is watching a basketball game in the comfort of their living room. Joe, enjoying a rare moment of relaxation, gets up to grab something from the kitchen. Patricia, still seated, hears a loud sound, a sharp, cracking noise that makes her heart stop. It's not the sound of a glass breaking or a dish falling. It's something unnatural, something violent, a sound that doesn't belong in their home. It happens so fast that her mind struggles to register it, but her instincts take over. She leaps to her feet, rushing toward the kitchen. She rushes to the kitchen. Joe is on the floor, motionless. Blood pools beneath him. She thinks, maybe a heart attack, maybe he hit his head. The sight paralyzes her for a split second. Her husband, her strong, dependable Joe, is lying there, lifeless. The metallic scent of blood fills the air, and panic seizes her chest. She drops to her knees, shaking him, calling his name, desperate for a response. But the stillness in his body tells her the truth before her mind can process it. Then, her eyes dart to the shattered window. The cold air rushes in, and she knows this was no accident. But the reality is far more horrifying. Joe Clark had been shot, ambushed in his own home. The news of Joe's murder spreads like wildfire through the law enforcement community. Officers and detectives arrive at the crime scene in minutes. The immediate priority: secure the area. To the men and women of the department, this isn't just another case. It's personal. They aren't just responding to a crime scene. They're responding to the home of a friend, a mentor, a brother in uniform. The sense of urgency is overwhelming. No one is thinking about sleep or schedules. They are thinking about justice and revenge. Sheriff's deputies comb through every inch of Joe's home. A chilling discovery is made. The plate glass window in the kitchen is shattered. Outside, on the ground, they find something even more alarming: shotgun pellets. The realization hits them like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a break-in gone wrong. This was calculated. Cold. Someone had waited, watched, and fired with precision. A single shot straight through the window designed to kill in an instant. Detectives now have a clear picture of what happened. The killer had positioned themselves behind a tree in the backyard. The shot came from outside the window, an expertly aimed blast from a shotgun. Joe Clark never saw it coming. There was no warning, no struggle, no final words. Just a trigger pulled in the darkness, and a life stolen in an instant. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. His colleagues struggled to process the loss. This wasn't just a murder, this was an execution. The weight of it settles heavily on their shoulders. This is more than just the death of an officer, it's an attack on their entire department. Someone had the audacity to target one of their own, to bring violence to a place that should have been safe. And that means one thing: no stone will be left unturned until justice is served. As officers begin to investigate, more evidence emerges. Witnesses report seeing a blue Ford Pinto idling near Joe's house on the night of the murder. Each person who saw it recalls the driver's odd behavior, covering his face when cars passed by. A small, seemingly insignificant detail, but in cases like this, every observation matters. The driver wasn't just loitering, he was hiding, and people don't hide unless they have something to conceal. The next day, investigators discover a military combat boot print near the crime scene. Not far from it, a single number 4 buck shotgun shell. The pieces of the puzzle start to form. A shotgun, military-style boots, a suspicious vehicle. The killer wasn't just some random criminal. This was someone trained, someone careful, someone who had planned every detail. But despite these early clues, the case stalls. For every lead, there's a dead end. Every suspect seems to have an alibi. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months. Joe's murder, once the department's highest priority, slowly becomes another file in an overflowing cabinet. Joe's murder remains unsolved. For years, the case haunts the department. Officers retire, leads dry up, and Joe's family is left without justice. And the worst part, the killer walks free, living a normal life, acting as if nothing happened, until 3 decades later. More than 30 years after Joe Clark's murder, Sheriff Larry Minks makes a decision that will change everything. He establishes a cold case unit. The team, led by seasoned investigators, revisits the case with fresh eyes. It's a second chance, a chance to do what should have been done years ago. The investigators aren't just looking for a suspect. They're looking to right a wrong, to bring closure to a family that has waited too long. Detectives re-examine Joe's home using advanced forensic scanning technology. The evidence points to something chilling. The shooter was a trained marksman. This wasn't a reckless attack. It was precise, cold, a professional execution. The trajectory analysis confirms that the shot came from a fixed position, fired with deadly accuracy. Whoever pulled the trigger didn't just hope to kill Joe Clark, they knew they would. The placement of the shot, the angle, and the choice of ammunition all indicate expertise. This was the work of someone who understood firearms at an advanced level, someone who had trained for this moment. It was a sniper-style attack. Precise, methodical. For detectives, this changes everything. It means the murder wasn't random, wasn't opportunistic, it was personal. The killer had planned this, likely for a long time, and trained shooters don't come from nowhere. They have backgrounds, histories, records. Someone, somewhere, had to know who was capable of something like this. New interviews lead to an old name, Mitchell Rubel. A former deputy, a man with military training, and someone with a deep personal grudge against Joe Clark. Detectives don't just find his name buried in old reports. They find whispers, stories passed down over the years, stories of a man who held on to anger, who never forgot a slight. Rubel isn't just a disgruntled ex-cop. He was a man who had been humiliated, stripped of his authority, and left to fester in resentment. In the months leading up to Joe's murder, Rubel had been fired from the sheriff's department. The person responsible for his termination? Lieutenant Joe Clark. And the more they dig, the darker the truth becomes. Investigators uncover details of an incident that had been buried in the past. Rubel had been accused of police brutality, taking a suspect to the Ohio River and beating him. Joe Clark had led the internal investigation that cost Rubel his badge. It wasn't just a firing, it was a public disgrace. And for a man like Rubel, proud, aggressive, and used to holding power, it was an unforgivable betrayal. That same suspect, years later, provided the name of the man who assaulted him, Mitchell Rubel. It's the confirmation detectives need, the kind of clue that connects everything. Rubel wasn't just angry at Joe, he had a motive that ran deep. A reason to see Joe not just as an enemy, but as a target. Everything starts to make sense. Then, a major breakthrough. Investigators locate a man named Todd Smith, an acquaintance of Rubel's from the 1980s. Smith had remained silent for decades, but when detectives promise him protection, he breaks. And what he says changes the case forever. Smith reveals the truth. On the night of Joe Clark's murder, Rubel came to his house. He asked for a shotgun, one that Rubel had given him previously. Smith gave it to him. It's an eerie moment, a gun being passed from one man to another with no questions asked. Smith didn't know then what it was for, but he knew Rubel. And looking back, the signs were there, the tension, the quiet rage that never seemed to leave him. Rubel left in his blue Ford Pinto. He was gone for a long time. That detail sticks with investigators. Not just the car, the same suspicious vehicle spotted near Joe's house, but the time unaccounted for. The gap between Rubel's departure and return, during which a single gunshot changed the course of history. When he returned, he was different, agitated. Smith recalls the look in Rubel's eyes. Not relief, not satisfaction, just a nervous energy, the kind that lingers after doing something irreversible. He was tense, on edge. He didn't say much, but what he did say was chilling. He threatened Smith, warned him to keep quiet. Smith had been too scared to speak until now. For detectives, this is it. The moment they've been waiting for. They have a suspect, a motive, a direct witness. But one piece is still missing, the murder weapon. Without it, there's still a sliver of doubt. Rubel has evaded justice for decades. If they are going to take him down, they need to be certain. They trace it through the years, following every lead. The search takes them to a military museum near Columbus, Ohio, where Rubel's old Air Force buddies hold a yearly reunion. A long shot, but worth it. Because sometimes, luck is on the side of justice, and then success. A man admits he once bought a shotgun from Rubel. He still has it. Ballistics testing confirms what detectives already suspect. This is the murder weapon. The forensic match is undeniable. The same gun that ended Joe Clark's life had been sitting, unnoticed, for years, waiting for the day when it would finally reveal the truth. The case is airtight. On September 15, 2015, police arrive at Mitchell Rubel's home. They arrest him for the murder of Joe Clark. The knock on his door is the sound of fate catching up. After 33 years, Rubel had likely convinced himself he was untouchable, that no one would ever connect the dots. That time had buried his crime. He was wrong. In court, the evidence is overwhelming. Witness testimonies, the murder weapon, the motive. Piece by piece, the prosecution lays it all out. Every decision, every action, every attempt Rubel made to erase his crime. The jury doesn't just see a man on trial, they see a man who thought he could outsmart justice. After a month-long trial, the verdict is read. Guilty. The sentence, life in prison. For Joe Clark's family, the moment is bittersweet. Justice has finally been served, but the pain of his loss will never fade. The courtroom is silent as Patricia Clark listens to the judge's ruling. A part of her heart will always be broken, but at least now she has answers. She knows the name of the man who stole her husband from her, and she knows he will never hurt anyone again. Mitchell Rubel, once a trusted deputy, now spends his days in the Ross Correctional Institution. A man who thought he had gotten away with murder. For 33 years, he lived free. But in the end, the truth caught up with him, and justice prevailed. Cold cases don't solve themselves. It takes dedicated investigators, relentless pursuit, and often the courage of those who finally come forward. If you know something, no matter how small, about an unsolved crime, speak up. Because somewhere, a family is still waiting for justice. And as Joe Clark's case proves, the truth can never stay hidden forever. It was a nippy December morning in 1992, with the students and staff at Rohrerstown Elementary School in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. all filled with holiday cheer. Only days away, Christmas made the classrooms buzz with anticipation, but not one classroom. Christy Marak was a dedicated 6th grade teacher who had failed to show up to work, which was absolutely uncharacteristic for her. She was never late, never absent without notice. Concerned colleagues tried calling her multiple times, but she didn't answer. With each ring, the worry grew stronger. 2 hours away, a call came from the school to her family, the principal. Christy hadn't arrived that morning. Panic immediately set in. Something was off. The principal, who was sensing the worst, decided to check on her himself. He arrived at her apartment complex. Her car was still there, its surface coated in a layer of ice, untouched for hours. He knocked on her door, no answer. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The police were summoned. Before him was a gruesome sight. Christy was lying dead in her living room. She had been brutally beaten, strangled, and sexually assaulted. There were clear marks on the body of a violent life struggle. Her body lay in disarray, her shirt up, her lower half otherwise exposed with a pair of socks on. Blood pooled near her head, bruises marked her face, and strangulation signs were visible around her neck. The principal ran out of the apartment, frantic, banging on neighbors' doors for help before calling 911. Police arrived within minutes and quickly secured the scene. A closer examination of the apartment revealed clear evidence of a struggle. Scuff marks on the floor and door frame indicated that Christy had fought back against her attacker. One stain on the carpet indicated some sort of bodily fluid, upon which investigators took a cut and sent to the laboratory. Police were able to continue with neighborhood canvassing, during which time one neighbor reported to the police that she had seen something suspicious that morning. She stated she was walking her dog about 7:15 a.m. and had seen a white or light-colored car parked near Christy's apartment complex. A man had stepped out, a white male, dark hair, unkempt, muscular build, and he walked toward Christy's home. Within minutes, a scream was heard. The woman and her roommate had heard it, but at the time they weren't sure what it meant. Using the description the witness provided, investigators were able to develop a composite of a suspect. With no leads coming in, the case soon grew frustrating. Christy had no known enemies, no reason for anyone to viciously harm her. For weeks, the police followed up on every lead. They investigated a peeping Tom in Christy's apartment complex, but nothing significantly linked up in the chain of evidence. Co-workers, friends, neighbors, anyone who might have known or suspected something were interviewed. The police questioned suspects, but again, nothing yielded. Months turned into years. More than 1,500 had been interviewed by 1995, and at least 60 possible suspects cleared. The investigation stalled. Christy's family held on to hope, but the unanswered questions were more than they could bear. Each passing Christmas reminded them of their lost loved one. For more than 2 decades, the case had gone cold until technology provided a break in 2018. And a new forensic tool was sweeping through criminal investigations, genetic genealogy. The same technique that had brought the Golden State Killer into custody was being applied now to DNA from Christy's crime scene. Investigators uploaded the DNA sample extracted from the carpet in Christy's apartment to a genealogy database. From there, forensic genealogists worked their way backward, tracing the suspect's ancestry and linking him to distant relatives. The search gradually narrowed down to one man, Raymond Rowe. He had been living in Lancaster the whole time, free to move within the community for 26 years. He was known as DJ Freeze, a popular entertainer who performed at nightclubs, private events, and weddings. He was charismatic and successful to those who knew him. But beneath the surface, he had been hiding a dark secret. Because Rowe had never been arrested, his DNA was not on file. The police needed a direct sample to confirm suspicions. They put surveillance on Rowe and followed him to an elementary school function where he would be performing. Following the event, Rowe discarded a water bottle and a piece of chewing gum. Detectives recovered them, sent them for analysis, and then waited. The results were conclusive. This DNA was an exact match to the evidence collected from Christie's crime scene. 26 years since Christy Marak had been murdered, finally, police had their suspect. Rowe was arrested and subsequently indicted on charges of first-degree murder, rape, and burglary. With the mountain of DNA evidence against him, he pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty. He received a sentence of life in prison without parole, plus 60 to 120 years. His capture sent shockwaves through the community. How had he managed to evade justice for so long? It would be hard for his family and friends to reconcile the man they knew with the violent predator that he had been. To them, he was an entertainer, a businessman, a normal citizen. But finally, the past had come to haunt him. Christie's family had been given the justice they waited for so long, yet it could never wipe away the pain. 2 decades of agony had passed with her parents, brothers, students at school. All those who loved and remembered her living with the loss of a daughter, sister, and friend. They fought for answers, always hoping that each new development might just bring them closer to the truth. Now, finally, they did. But the question of why still lingered. Investigators theorized that Rowe had been stalking Christy, possibly the very peeping Tom reported in her apartment complex, and that his obsession led him to follow her schedule until the day he could find his opportunity. Once more, only he knew, and he never said why. He was remanded to the State Correctional Institution, Phoenix, where he will spend the rest of his days. Though justice had finally been meted out, the scar of that morning in December 1992 remains. Christy Marak was young, full of promise, and a dedicated soul committed to shaping young minds. She had a future, a family that loved her, and students who looked up to her. But that is not just a tragic story of how one single act of violence can demolish so many lives. On the other hand, it also speaks volumes of perseverance. Detectives never quitting for 26 years, forcibly changing forensic science, and meaning no case can ever be considered ice cold. And lastly, to Christie's family, though this pain will never go away, at least they can say her killer has finally been caught. The murder of Christy Marak had haunted the detectives and devastated her loved ones for over 2 decades. Among those names etched in time, as it were, with investigators who can't let some cases fade back into the distant past, justice finally caught up with the murderer in 2018. The DNA evidence collected at the scene had always been the key, but for years technology hadn't been advanced enough to identify a suspect. That all changed with the rise of forensic genealogy. By uploading the DNA of the suspect into GED Match, the investigators found distant relatives and began tracing the family tree. It was painstaking work sorting through generations and mapping out relationships, narrowing possibilities. Then came the breakthrough, a direct link to Raymond Rowe. It sounded almost unbelievable at first, a man who had lived in the community for decades, who had built a reputation as a respected DJ attending weddings, dancing with families, and celebrating in joyous occasions, knowing what he had done. But the DNA didn't lie. Now, police needed undeniable proof. For days, surveillance teams watched Rowe, just waiting for an opportunity. When he performed at a school event, they watched him drink from a water bottle and later chew gum, discarding them in the trash. Those items were quickly retrieved and sent for testing. The results left no room for doubt. His DNA was a perfect match to the evidence left at the scene of Christy Marak's murder. There was no more guessing, no more speculation. After 26 years, police finally had their man. The arrest came swiftly. Officers moved in and took Rowe into custody. The community was in shock. How had he escaped justice for so long? How had he lived among them without raising suspicion? The news brought a mix of emotions for Christie's family. Relief, shock, anger, it all swirled together. So long, they had lived without answers. Now they had one, but it didn't bring Christy back. The legal process moved quickly. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Rowe knew he had no way out. Rather than take his chances in a trial, He chose to plead guilty. In return, he avoided the death penalty. His sentence was serious, however: life in prison with no chance of parole, plus an additional 60 to 120 years. The sentence was delivered. The courtroom was silent. Christie's family watched the man who brutally murdered their little girl accept his fate. There were no apologies, no explanations. He never spoke of why he did it. He never offered remorse. Some surmised he had been obsessed with Christie, that he had been stalking her prior to the attack. Others believed it was a crime of opportunity. The truth, however, would more than likely never be known. Rowe was transferred to the State Correctional Institution, Phoenix, a maximum security prison where he would spend the rest of his life. The man, who had once been known as DJ Freeze, would never again walk free. For Christie's family, there was justice, but no real closure. Her parents had spent years grieving the daughter they lost. Her brother Vince had struggled with the pain of losing his sister so suddenly, so violently. Her students, now adults, still remembered the teacher who had encouraged them, who had believed in them, who had once filled their classroom with warmth and laughter. The town of Lancaster would never forget Christie Marac. Her murder had scarred the community, yet she was still remembered. Her case proved one thing: even after all those years, justice could still be found. The power of forensic genealogy opened cold cases previously thought unsolvable. Killers who thought they had gotten away with their crimes were finally paying the price for them. And though Christie's life had been stolen from her, her story was not forgotten. Her name remained a symbol of resilience, of determination, and of the unwavering pursuit of justice. Raymond Rowe had spent 26 years believing he had beaten the system. He had lived more than 20 years, had built a life one that would seem normal to any person who did not know his secret. He had a career, a reputation, and a place in the community. He was the DJ at celebrations, the man people turned to for entertainment at weddings and parties. But beneath the surface, there had always been a lie. When the truth finally came out, the people who knew him were in a state of utter disbelief that such a thing could happen. Friends and acquaintances could not put together the man they knew with this predator he had become. Some refused to believe it at first. How could this person, so outwardly charming and integrated into the community, have done something so horrific? His family was no less shocked. No one had suspected anything or envisioned that such a horrific secret could have been borne for years by their son, brother, uncle. Teetering on disbelief, some would not discuss it at all, while others quietly kept themselves at arm's length from him. Rowe himself remained silent. Even faced with the overwhelming DNA evidence, he had no explanation, no excuse. He took his sentence on the chin and didn't appeal, but gave those who had been searching for the answer for the past decades absolutely no closure. The pain in Christie Marac's family had never completely gone away. Her mother had spent years waking up in the middle of the night, wondering who had done this to her daughter. Her father had walked past Christmas decorations every year, each one reminding him of the holiday Christie never got to celebrate. Her brother Vince had spent his adult life with a hole in his heart, one that could never be filled. Now they had justice, but justice didn't bring peace. No catharsis swept the courtroom as Rowe sat before them. He never turned to face them, offered no words of remorse. There was no apology, no explanation, only silence. It was as if the air had changed for the community of Lancaster, living with the unsolved murder of Christie for so long. Decades of fear that a killer had walked among them was finally put to rest. But in its place, something else had emerged. A deep, unsettling realization. For 26 years he had lived among them. He had smiled, laughed, entertained crowds. He had stood beside them at grocery stores, driven down the same streets, walked the same sidewalks, and no one had known. His case became the stuff of cautionary tales. People started to question this belief that killers always looked like monsters, like they were easy to spot. That evil had a face you could recognize. because the truth was far scarier. Evil could fit in. It could sit across from you at a dinner table. It could play music at your wedding. It could wave at you from across the street. And for 26 years, no one had seen it. The investigation into Christy Marak's murder became one of the most well-known cases to be solved using forensic genealogy. It was not only her case, it was what the case represented. Time no longer protected criminals, no matter how long they lived with their secrets. No matter how much they had convinced themselves they had gotten away with it, science could still find them. It also set a new precedent for police departments across the country. The technique police used to find Roe was now being implemented in other cold cases. Families that had waited for decades now had hope. Christie's case became more than just a tragedy. It became a turning point. While her family would never get her back, they knew her story helped to change the course of justice. Because of Christie, because of the tireless effort by investigators, and because of the march of forensic science, another name had joined the growing ranks of those killers who could no longer hide from the past. And as long as that science existed, as long as there were detectives who refused to give up, there would be more. More names, more justice, more cases finally solved. Christy Marak's case is a reminder that justice is never out of reach. Even when years pass, even when leads go cold, even when a case seems impossible to solve, there is always hope. Her story is not just about tragedy, but about perseverance, about the detectives who refused to give up, about the scientists who pushed forensic technology forward, about a family who never stopped searching for the truth. And it's a testament to the power of DNA, evidence that never forgets, never fades, never lies. Because of forensic genealogy, cold cases once thought unsolvable are being reopened. Victims who were once just names in forgotten police files are finally getting justice. And killers, no matter how long they have lived in the shadows, are being exposed. But there are still more cases out there, more families waiting for answers, more justice left to be served. If Christie's story teaches us anything, it's that we cannot stop searching, that advancements in science must continue, that funding for cold case investigations must be prioritized, that no case should ever be abandoned. And if you have any information about an unsolved case, no matter how small, no matter how insignificant it might seem, now is the time to come forward. Because justice delayed is not justice denied, and no killer should ever be able to hide forever.